they're here to listen, but I thought it was for the business community. I didn't know it was this. That's because your brother called yell at you. Nobody told us.
Vanessa. Okay.
That's right. You want to trust me. That's scary.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to listening session 2. There are a number of seats down front here. I know they're not as valuable as the ones in the back, but
Sure.
I guarantee you that none of us can throw as far as those seats.
You know what they can.
They might come this way.
I don't know. Pretty good.
First thing I'd like to do is to start on the far end and have each of us at the dais introduce ourselves to you, in case you haven't had the opportunity to meet us.
Thank you. Ed Hunzecker, County Administrator.
Vicki Palmer, County Attorney.
Vanessa Ball, Commissioner of District 5.
Betsy Bennett, Commissioner at Large, District 7, and spent 11 years working for Manatee County government, so been there.
Michael Gallen, District 2 Commissioner, born and raised here in Manatee County, and we're in District 2, which is my district.
And I'm Larry Bussell, and I'm serving this year as the chairman of the County Commission. My district is District 1, which is essentially everything north of the river.
John Chappie, District 3, which is pretty much everything west of 26th Street, west between the Manatee River and south to Sarasota Bay, including the Barrier Islands.
Robin DeSapatino, sorry, I got a little tickle here. County Commissioner, District 4, South County, and I know a lot of people here from South County. I really appreciate it, and a pleasure to serve you. The district runs from Cortez, south of the county line, Lockwood Ridge on the east, and 34th Street on the west. Thank you.
Carol Whitmore, lived in Manatee County 44 years. I'm a nurse, and I am an at-large commissioner, which is the whole county.
Linda Campana, Clerk of Circuit Court, lived here all my life.
And she's new, and it's her first meeting.
Not new.
Don't get nervous.
Vicki Tessmer, Board Records, Clerk of the Court.
Well, thank you. And now I'd like to welcome you again. And I can tell from the standing room only crowd that it's a subject of interest. I'm glad you're here. We're all glad you're here, and we're glad that we have an opportunity to meet with you and to talk about things that are pretty important and of great interest to all of us. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our county administrator to proceed with the program.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, we've heard from the sheriff's folks back last fall. We've heard from the EMS folks since that date. Today we have the opportunity to hear from the rest of the workforce. And according to the data provided in your handouts, the cost of living over the years has increased by 11%. Employees have been contributing to their retirement, increased cost of the health care plan, Social Security contributions have gone up. Last year, you approved a 3% increase for the most important part of our county government, the employees. But those increases have been overwhelmed by the increases in those costs that I've talked to you about. If we truly wish to be an employer of choice, especially with a rebounding labor market, we must be certain to have a pay plan for progression through the pay ranges. You've heard stories about pay compression. It's a very expensive issue. We would like to have a discussion about pay progression, and we'll have a presentation of that in a moment. This includes market equity adjustments as needed, as well as a funded capacity for pay for performance. I plan to bring you a plan as part of the budget process this spring to fund such a plan. But today we would like to hear from the employees about their concerns about our pay and our pay system over the years. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the chair to listen to the employees.
You're not going to have the overview before the discussion or the...
No, I think we would hear from the employees.
Sounds good to me.
Oh, excuse me. I think we have a presentation first.
Right.
You're right. From Jeff,
Mr. Ling,
Mr. Ling. There he is.
Dr. Ling,
I
sorry.
didn't see you there, Jeffrey.
Sorry about that. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. We've taken the liberty of preparing a short presentation to give an overview of where the county has been. We've worked with you for a number of years, and we want to spend a brief moment talking about the last study, the update we did of that study, and tie into the county administrator's comments about what the current status would be of your pay practices vis-a-vis the marketplace. We can have the PowerPoint. We'll start off and move through that. Our objective today is really to talk to you very, very briefly about the question, how will you pay or how will you compensate? And employee compensation in Manatee County so that you be recognized as an employer of choice. And when we first worked with you now, almost 10 years ago, that was the question we attempted to answer then. We made a series of recommendations, and I'll talk very briefly about those today. And what we attempted to focus on is that issue of pay compression as well as pay progression. And no one, I don't think, at the beginning of that study anticipated the economy would hit what it did in 2008, and that process would then absorb us for a number of years, where I think many of us hoped it would be 1 or 2 years. It's now been a rather lengthy process that we've been dealing with the economic downturn. And so we want to revisit some of the things we recommended, but with an eye for the future. And then secondly, we want to talk about what would be some of the dollar amounts that we looked at then and how have they aged over time, because obviously the market's changed and some of those expenses have changed over time. As background, prior to 2008, it had been 20 years since Manatee County had conducted a compensation classification study. And there's really two purposes to a compensation classification study. One is external facing, where we want to find out what others pay for the same skills that people here at the county have. So if I leave the county and go to work somewhere else, how much can I make? The second piece is internal. If I work beside someone every day and we do roughly the same job, are we being compensated in the same manner? Not dollar for dollar, not $20.18 each, but are we paid in a similar manner if we do similar work for the county? And that was our charge in 2008. We brought back a full report. Some of you, I believe, were members of the board at the time when we met, and we had a workshop about those results. On February 5th, 2009, you adopted the results of the study and put that in place. However, very, very shortly thereafter, the issue of limited funding came into play. And in April 2012, we were asked to come back and look at what's really happened since 2009. And I'll share very, very briefly again some of the results from both of those frames of reference. In 2008, we found that at the midpoint, the middle of your ranges on average, you were about 4% behind market. Meaning if I came to work for the county and worked to the point in which I was in the middle of the range, I would be about 4% behind my peers in other public organizations. I would start off roughly at the market rate, 1.6% below, but by the time I reached the maximum, or the end of my career, I would be about 5% behind what I would be if I worked at another city or county within the local area. What was important about that, and what we emphasized and employees emphasized to us in the meetings that we had at the time, is I am disincentivized to stay with the county. What this means to me is as I remain with the county over time, I'm losing buying power. I'm losing the ability to buy milk, bread, gasoline, buy a new home, whatever the case might be. And so eventually I'll vote with my feet. Eventually I'll go out and find other employment because I know I can do the same thing I'm doing here, but make a little bit more somewhere else. And keep in mind, these were the averages across all the jobs that we considered. Some jobs had a larger market difference than 5%, and some jobs were actually at the market when we went through that process previously. Also in 2008, we came back to you with 4 recommendations on addressing that, or 4 core recommendations on addressing those issues. One was to implement a new pay plan that closed that gap, and that was completed. It was adopted by the board and implemented. The second component of that was implemented as well was to bring everyone onto that new pay plan. So some employees were paid lower than what the minimums that were recommended in the pay plan included, and so those individuals had to be at least brought onto the minimum of the new pay plan, and that was a cost, recurring cost of $434,000. And that was completed. 424 employees were moved to new minimums as part of that study. The third component, as the county administrator alluded to, related to compression, or the issue that I remain with the county over a certain period of time, and new people that are hired in close to what I make, if not the same that I make. And an example that many employees shared with us, I've been with the county 5 or 6 years. John gets hired next week and he makes what I do. That's compression. So someone's making the same that I am. I've been here 5 years. That person just came in the door. And back in 2008, we estimated a cost of $1.6 million to correct for that clustering or that compression that was present within your system. And there was a lack of funds to implement that recommendation. And the fourth recommendation was the process of moving forward with pay for performance. So having a component that addressed the market, putting people where they should be vis-a-vis the marketplace for that hypothetical average performer, but also having the flexibility and ability for your management team to reward those employees that went above and beyond and provide additional compensation to those employees. And that was a work in progress. That was something that we recommended once you have your house in order to address the market. Once you pay people fairly on average, then move on to putting into place something that would reward your high performers and retain your high performers over time. In 2012, we didn't look at exactly the same jobs again. We looked at a different sample, and we found that you were roughly 1% on average below or above, depending on which set of the jobs that we were looking at in the 94 classifications, what the market would be. And 1% plus or minus means you were basically at the market. So the question might be asked, what changed between 2008 and 2012? And quite frankly, some of your peers reduced their pay scales. A number of your peers went through major reductions in force, and some of your peers simply got out of some of the businesses they're in, meaning they began to offer those services through outsourcing contracts or other mechanisms, and so they no longer had those parts or components of their pay plans. Now keep in mind, all the statistics that I've shared with you up to this point is not the take-home pay. These are just the ranges. This is my potential earning power. It's not necessarily what I make in Manatee County. Then when we drill down into those 94, and this is just as relevant, although we found your scales match other people's scales after they have gone through the adjustments of the economic downturn, 44% of the 94 positions were still below market. So what that means is even with your other folks changing their scales or adjusting their scales, almost half of the 94 classifications would still be on a scale lower than what the scale would be somewhere else. And 22% of that 94 classifications we took a look at would be more than 5%. And once we get outside of 5%, that's more or less the magic number that it does have an impact on behavior. It's not that I leave the day that it reaches 5%, but I begin to look at, well, maybe driving a little bit further to the south or a little bit further north makes sense if I can make a little bit more money. And so that's usually the benchmark that we look at for when you start to have people to make changes or make adjustments in their behavior and where they work. Why is this important? One, you're in a relatively competitive area. Two is even with the rollbacks that occurred, many local governments hoped that would close the gap they had from before the recession. They hoped that nature would fix it versus changes in their compensation structure. And what we find is, yes, nature brought you closer together, but in fact didn't create overlap between your pay plan and the pay plan of your peers. What are the three issues moving forward? So we've been looking backwards more or less up to this point. There's three things that we'd like for you to consider as you look at compensation moving forward. One is this compression issue that was present before and hasn't been addressed up to this point. And again, that idea that people are being hired in and making the same amount that I do after years of service with the county. The second is how should you respond to the external market? Because as the county administrator indicated, by most projections, we will see a slow recovery moving forward. The worst is behind us, and we will see this gradual increase in the competitiveness of the labor market. And the third, which he highlighted as well, is how do we progress people? How do we move people forward in the future? What should be our plan in the future? And as he mentioned, we shared with you a little bit of the erosion of buying power that your staff assembled of the 11%. I want to talk a little bit about what people are predicting for next year, the year after, because I think that'll be helpful also. With compression, really what we're talking about are those small differentials, again, that don't take into account experience, skills, level, performance, seniority. In essence, it's the overlapping that occurs. They're most common symptoms in starting salaries of new employees. So where this occurs most often is in the first 25% of your pay plan. So the more people are clustered in the lower portion of your pay ranges, the higher the probability they're suffering from compression. What are the causes? There's two primary causes. One is the labor market effect. If we think back to pre-2008, the Florida market was going up and up and up every year. And by most estimates, the 10 years before the downturn, it was moving between 5 and 7% per year for public employees, meaning most public employees were receiving increases on average of between 5 and 7% if you included everything that went into increases. So regardless of what they called it or what categories they came from, whether it was performance, whether it was merit, whether it was cost of living, if you added them all together, it was 5 to 7%. So very quickly, what was occurring within the state is you could fall behind. Or you could begin to hire people on top of what you're paying people that were currently within your system, and that's the labor market effect. And that did contribute to the compression that you have present. The second was a pay plan effect, and that's where your internal compensation structure is not responsive, meaning you don't update your plan very often. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it had been about 20 years since you had gone through a formal process of updating your plan. That's a lot of erosion that takes place over time in a period where Florida was increasing almost every year from a compensation standpoint. And both of those effects impacted and led to that dollar amount that we proposed to you in 2008 for needed correction or adjustment. If we look at what you would need to spend today, and these are rough estimates, we didn't conduct the comprehensive study that we did in 2008, 2009, but based on who you have working here and the increased amount of overlap that you've accumulated over time, now the cost to fix this issue would be somewhere between $3.2 and $6.1 million. So this is a substantial amount of money to create that parity or space people out in your pay plan, taking into account the compression that was present in the past and has grown over time. With the labor market, the second issue, it is dynamic and changing over time. Different jobs go up while others go down. We all know that there's certain jobs that are in higher demand than others. There's certain jobs that, quite frankly, if you work outside or you work in the heat, they're hard jobs to keep people in, because they're taxing, and there's certain jobs that are very stressful, that there's a lot of accountability, responsibility. The market responds differently to each of those type jobs, and who's coming out of school and the skills they have impact that as well. And information today plays more of a role in that than ever before. People know what the market will bear for their jobs. As we move to the internet and the access of things on the internet, it's very easy for me to find out what I can make somewhere else, where that wouldn't have been the case 20 years ago. I would have had to go through a lot of newspapers, go to the library, do a lot of research. Today, in about 15, 20 minutes, sitting in my living room on my iPad or on my laptop, I can get a pretty good idea what other people make that do what I do. And because of that, perception of the work environment has become more important, and your compensation practices have become part of your brand. Manatee County has a brand in the labor market. You are known as a certain type of employer. And if you're the employer of choice, which would be a branding placement that you would have, then there's certain pay practices or pay elements that go along with that, and how you pay, how you move people up over time. And if that's your goal, being responsive to the labor market would be part of the strategy that you would adopt to reach that goal. What we find is the cost of living has increased greater than what wages have increased in the majority of employers in your relative market. And your relative market would stretch from Tampa and south to Lee County. If we look at that region, food and fuel did a really good job of opening up that gap over the last several years. Purchasing power has diminished significantly since 2008, and as the county administrator mentioned, roughly 11%. And the estimated average for next year, or the year that we're in now going into the next year, is between 2 and 3% more, is what things will increase overall. When we survey local governments within the state, and we have a significant client base here in Florida, we're a Florida corporation, most local governments are going to move their pay plans and their employee pay somewhere in that 2 to 3% range. And so that's what we're seeing out there, which is an increase. If we looked at this time last year, it was closer to 1 to 2. Before that, when you counted everyone that was doing 0, it was much closer to 0 to 1%. And so we're seeing a progressive increase in what local governments are doing in regards to their pay practices and maintaining their pay system over time. What's our conclusion, or our overall conclusion? There's a number of things that weren't addressed before. Progression is very important as you look forward to the future. Progression will help address the compression that you have, but more importantly, it'll send a message to the marketplace that you want to be competitive and you want to reward those that are your star players. People that come here, give 110%, you have a mechanism for recognizing them as well as rewarding them over time. What progression really means is if I come to work here out of trade school, out of vocational school, out of high school, out of college, out of graduate school, where can I go? Based on where I start, where do I end up at the end of my career? And is that a good trade-off for the time that I would commit to this organization? And how does that work? And how fair do I feel that it is? What we're asking you to do is consider what would be the best mechanism to match your strategic goals or objectives as an organization. And by doing that, how do you address, if you will, the discrepancies from the past while ensuring you're putting the right foot forward for the future? And so we're asking you to consider market equity and how you want to address equity in the future. Where do you want to position yourself versus the market? But also consider the county administrator's plan of once you address that market plateau, how do you move forward with a pay for performance or a mechanism of recognizing your high performers? So those are the formal things that we prepared. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Any questions?